The silence of James Boone's ranch was a living thing, a creature he had nurtured for 3 long years in the hollow space his wife and child had left behind. But on a morning sharp enough to crack bone, a sound from the barn, a faint, human whisper of a sound tore a hole in that carefully constructed quiet, and through it the world rushed in. James moved across the frost-hardened earth, his boots making a dull, percussive rhythm against the ground. The wind, a razor-thin blade, sliced through the gaps in the old barn's timbers. He'd been on his way to check the mare that had foaled the week prior, but the noise pulled him from his path. It was a rustle, a furtive shifting from the corner, where his old wagon sat, its bed layered with hay intended for the deepest part of winter. He froze. Another sound, clearer this time, a smothered cough, impossibly small, a child's cough. James's brow tightened into a knot. He approached the wagon with the caution of a man tracking a wounded animal, his shadow stretching thin and long in the morning's weak light. Another shuffle, then an absolute breathless stillness. Reaching the wagon, he lifted the corner of the canvas tarp. His hand was steady, but a cold unease coiled in his gut. There, nestled in the hay like a litter of stray pups, were 4 children. They didn't cry out or even flinch. They simply stared, their eyes vast and dark in their gaunt, pale faces. The eldest, a girl who couldn't be more than 10, had her arms locked around the others in a fierce, protective embrace, her chin lifted with a defiance that trembled at the edges. A boy with chapped, wind-scoured cheeks blinked slowly, as if anticipating a strike. The smallest girl, her face smudged with dirt, sucked her thumb with a quiet intensity, while the youngest boy, no older than 5, had his face buried so deeply in his sister's side he seemed to be trying to disappear entirely. James said nothing. He took a half-step back, his gaze probing the deeper shadows of the wagon bed, and then he saw her, a woman, crumpled on her side, an arm bent at an unnatural angle over her midsection. Her dress was ripped at the shoulder, and a dark, crusted stain marred the cuff of her sleeve. Her breathing was a shallow, fragile thing, barely stirring the air. He let out a slow, heavy breath. At 36, James Boone had buried a wife and a daughter born sleeping. He had faced down blizzards, droughts, and men whose hearts were as barren as the winter ground. But the sight of those children silent, starving, and wrapped around one another as if they'd all grown from a single damaged root, shook him in a way he hadn't been shaken in years. There were no questions to be asked, no curses to be uttered. He simply turned and went back to his cabin, returning with a heavy wool blanket, a lantern, and a pot of beans from the night before. The children were exactly as he'd left them. "Are you hungry?" he asked, his voice rough from disuse, but not unkind. The oldest girl gave a single, slow blink. It was all the answer he needed. He climbed carefully into the wagon, the hay rustling beneath his boots, and gently draped the blanket over the woman. Her eyelids fluttered, revealing eyes clouded with confusion before they drifted shut again. "Ma'am," he asked softly. She managed a nearly imperceptible nod. "Clara," she whispered, her voice a dry rasp. "Oh, Samuel." That was all before consciousness abandoned her once more. James lifted her with a gentleness that belied his size. She was unnervingly light, no heavier than a sack of grain. He saw the way her children recoiled as he moved, especially the little one who tried to burrow even deeper into his sister, as if shame were a physical burden. He didn't remark on it, he just nodded to the eldest girl. "Bring your siblings. The cabin is warm." The walk was short, but it felt impossibly long, marked by the sound of 6 silent footsteps following his own. He didn't turn to look, but he could hear them, the soft scuff of worn shoes on brittle grass, the faint, choked sniffle from the girl who'd been sucking her thumb. Inside the cabin, he revived the dying embers in the hearth with a practiced hand. He laid the woman Eliza, he now knew he might call her, on the cot near the fire, covering her with a quilt his wife had stitched the winter before she passed. The children huddled together by the door, small shadows clinging to the edge of the light. "Table's clean," he said. "Sit." They hesitated, then moved as one, approaching the rough-hewn table with a kind of solemn reverence. There were no smiles, no words, only a deep, silent hunger that felt sacred in its desperation. He filled 4 bowls with the beans and set out the last of his cornbread. The youngest boy, Leo, fumbled with his spoon, and the girl, Clara, silently reached over to steady his hand. No one asked for more. James didn't eat. He simply watched, taking in the details of their faces, their small, chapped hands, the haunted look in their eyes. When they were finished, they sat perfectly still, like sparrows uncertain if a storm had truly passed. He spoke to the girl again. "You all have names." "I'm Clara," she said, her voice thin as winter sunlight. "He's Samuel." "That's Alice." "The little one is Leo." He nodded slowly. "You're safe here." She blinked, her small mouth tightening into a firm line. "You don't know us." "No," he agreed. "But I know what the cold does to a body. And I know what sort of marks get left on a woman's skin." That silenced her. Outside, the wind howled, rattling the glass in the single window frame. The scent of pine smoke and old memories permeated the small cabin. Eliza stirred on the cot but didn't wake. Later, James brought in a bucket of water from the well, heated it on the stove, and gestured to the wash basin. "The little ones can wash up. I'll take these clothes out to the barn." Clara hesitated, then gave a small nod of assent, herding the others toward the basin. James gathered their soiled, ragged clothes into a bundle. Each garment was a story of hardship. Clara's dress was stained near the hem. Samuel's shirt was a patchwork of repairs, the threads worn thin. No child should have to wear such sorrow that by the time he returned from the barn, the children were asleep on a pallet he'd made by the fire, curled into a tight knot, as if they feared being pulled apart. Eliza's breathing was still shallow, but steady. James sat in his worn armchair across from her, his hat resting on the table beside him. He poured a cup of black coffee and stared into the flames, not seeking answers, but simply for the company of the light. He was not a man who asked for things. The land was deaf to prayers, and the cold was indifferent to pleas. But as he watched this broken family, burned out by a storm he couldn't yet name, a strange feeling stirred in his chest. It wasn't pity, nor was it charity. It was something older, something that echoed the silence of the unused cradle stored in the loft. It was the ghost of a child's laughter that had not graced these walls in years. It was in the simple, profound way Clara had laid her brother's hand on her own chest to soothe him, a mother long before her time. He didn't know what it meant, but he knew one thing for certain. Whatever had brought them here wasn't finished with them yet. He looked toward the window as the fire crackled, watching the frost and the pain begin to melt in long, slow streaks. Something had broken his silence, both inside his home and within his soul, and the world felt like it was about to come knocking. Eliza woke to a dull, throbbing ache wrapped in an unfamiliar warmth. A fire crackled somewhere nearby. Her head rested on something soft, and a heavy quilt was drawn up to her chin. She opened her eyes to strange wooden rafters above her, the air thick with the scent of wood smoke and pine. Her first thought, a sharp, panicked instinct, was for the children. She tried to sit up too quickly, and a wave of dizziness washed over her. The sound of boots on wood brought James into her line of sight. He turned from the stove, a tin cup in his hand. He didn't speak, just crossed the room and crouched beside the cot, handing her the cup with the slow, deliberate care one might use with a spooked horse. "Drink." The coffee was strong, bitter, and hot. It steadied her shaking hands. She quickly tucked them under the quilt, hiding a bruised wrist from his view. His gaze followed the movement, but his face remained impassive. "Your children are asleep," he said. "They've eaten." "Thank you," she whispered, her voice barely audible. He gave a single nod and returned to the fire. The cabin was hushed, the air heavy with unspoken things. Her eyes found her children in the corner. Alice slept with her thumb tucked in her mouth. Leo was curled beside her. Samuel lay on his stomach, his knees drawn up beneath him, and Clara slept sitting up against the wall, a broom handle resting by her hand like a sentry spear. They had endured more than just the cold. Eliza tried to rise again, but a sharp pain in her side pinned her down. She winced, the ache in her arm flaring in response. James noticed. "You're hurt. Don't push it." "I can work," she said immediately, the words tumbling out. "I won't accept charity. I didn't offer any," he replied. "I offered a fire and 4 plates of food. That isn't the same." His voice was flat, a simple statement of fact that was impossible to argue with. He walked out of the cabin then, without a coat, leaving her alone with her shame and the rhythmic breathing of her children. She sat perfectly still, listening to the wind. Her fingers gently probed the blossoming bruise on her arm. She could still hear Silas's voice, a cruel, mocking echo in her mind. She squeezed her eyes shut, swallowing the fear that rose in her throat. When James returned, she had managed to get her feet on the floor, the quilt folded neatly beside her. She forced herself to stand as he entered, ignoring the way the room tilted. "You don't need to prove anything to me," he said, hanging his coat on a peg. "I wasn't trying to." He said nothing, but crossed to a small wooden chest by the hearth. He pulled out a folded dress, plain, grey and worn, but immaculately clean. He placed it on the table. "It was my wife's. You can take it in, if you have the skill." Eliza nodded, holding the soft, worn fabric for a moment longer than necessary. She could feel the presence of the woman who had worn it, a practical, sturdy woman who had built a life here. "I can sew," she said. He grunted. "That'll be useful." The day settled into a quiet, unspoken rhythm. The children, upon waking, ate a breakfast of porridge, and then found small ways to make themselves useful. Samuel trailed after James to the barn, his expression one of silent, intense curiosity. Clara swept the floor until it was spotless. Eliza watched as Alice, unasked, stood on a stool to wash the breakfast bowls. They worked like small creatures who understood instinctively that their continued safety depended on their utility. Eliza scrubbed the tabletop, trying not to favor her injured arm. James returned from his morning chores and stood in the doorway, watching her. "You're in pain," he stated. "I'm accustomed to it." "That doesn't make it right." A lump formed in her throat. She turned away from him, her hands moving. Faster, he didn't press her. Instead, he walked to the stove and stirred the pot of soup she had started. "You're a good cook." "I used to be." "Who for?" "My husband," she said, her voice catching, before he passed. James looked at her then, a long, searching gaze that felt like a physical weight. It held no judgment, no pity, just a quiet, steady appraisal. "That bruise you're hiding," he said, his voice low. It wasn't a question. She stopped scrubbing, her back rigid. "I'm not hiding anything. Don't lie, Eliza." She spun to face him, her voice sharp with defensiveness. "You have no idea what I'd been through." "No," he said, his tone softening, "but I can guess, and I don't need to know all of it to see that you're scared." Her jaw trembled. She bit down hard on her lip, refusing to cry in front of this stranger with his large, capable hands and quiet eyes that saw far too much. "I'll earn our keep," she insisted. "We won't be a burden, you aren't." The silence that followed was thick with unspoken meaning. The children watched from the edges of the room, pretending not to listen. Later that afternoon, James saddled his horse for a ride into the nearby town. Eliza offered to accompany him, but he simply shook his head. "Rest that arm, I'll be back by dusk." In town, James purchased flour, salt, and a fresh bar of soap. As the storekeeper, Mrs. Gable, tallied his items, she raised a speculative eyebrow. "Feeding an army these days." James didn't reply. Her smile turned conspiratorial. "You know, people are talking. Say you've taken in some woman you found on the road, a widow with a whole brood of children, they say." He met her gaze, his expression unreadable. "You ever hear the wind howling through a crack in your wall at night, Mrs. Gable?" She blinked, taken aback. "Well, I suppose so." "Then you know what the cold feels like," he said, his voice flat. "And you ought to know better than to gossip." He paid for his goods and walked out, leaving her speechless. Back at the cabin, Eliza watched the first snowflakes of the season begin to fall, dusting the fields in a fine white powder. The children were quiet. Clara was braiding Alice's hair, while Samuel looked intently at the pictures in a tattered almanac. Leo sat on the floor, softly drumming a wooden spoon against a log. Eliza held the grey dress in her lap, her fingers working deftly to adjust the seams, despite the persistent ache in her arm. She didn't hear James enter. He placed the sack of supplies on the counter. Then, from his coat pocket, he produced 2 sticks of peppermint candy. He placed one in Alice's lap and the other in Leo's small, outstretched hand. He said nothing. Eliza stared at him, her throat tightening. "Just something sweet," he mumbled, as if embarrassed. "It's not a promise of anything." She nodded once, her lips pressed together to hold back the sudden wave of emotion. That night, long after the children were asleep, Eliza stood by the hearth, the mended dress hanging from a peg nearby. "You didn't have to defend me in town," she said softly. He didn't turn from the fire. "I wasn't defending you." She looked at him then, trying to read the lines of his face in the flickering light. He met her gaze without evasion. "I was defending them." Her eyes shimmered with unshed tears, but she said nothing more. She simply sat by the fire, cradling her arm, The bruises were still there, hidden beneath her sleeve. But for the first time in a long time, something else was beginning to stir beneath her skin, a fragile, terrifying flicker of hope. The past was still out there, and it would likely come, looking for them, but maybe, just maybe, it wouldn't find them undefended. The snow fell for 3 straight days, blanketing the world in a profound and peaceful hush. Inside James's cabin, a quiet warmth had begun to take root, not in grand gestures, but in small, sacred routines. The clink of spoons against bowls, the whisper of Clara's broom across the floorboards, the soft murmur of Eliza's voice. As she read a story to the children before bed, Eliza stirred a simmering stew, the movement of her arm now fluid and nearly painless. She didn't look up as James came in, his arms laden with firewood, his coat and beard dusted with silver. "Storm's heading west," he said, stacking the logs by the hearth. "Looks like it'll miss us." Eliza nodded. "Good, the livestock will stay dry. You've been checking on them." It was a statement, not a question. "They're starting to trust me." Mostly. A ghost of a smile touched his lips. "Goats don't trust anyone. They just tolerate us for the grain." She almost smiled back, but the moment was fleeting. A shy bird startled into flight. She ladled the stew into bowls, her hands now steady. The physical scars were fading, but her spirit still bore the memory of how quickly a hand could be raised in violence. The children tumbled in, their cheeks flushed, and their boots wet with melted snow. Samuel, ever the little man, helped Clara with her coat. Alice carried in a small, smooth stone she'd found, and Leo, as usual, attached himself to Eliza's skirt, his presence a silent comfort. They ate with the focused intensity of children who had known true hunger. James watched them, his presence at the table no longer that of a stone sentinel in the corner, but of the central beam that held the roof aloft. After the meal, a quiet industry filled the cabin. Samuel followed James to the barn to help with the evening chores. Clara sat by the fire, mending a sock with small, perfect stitches. Alice pressed dried wildflowers between the pages of an old Bible she'd found. On a shelf, Eliza, her arms dusted with flour, kneaded dough for the morning's bread, her movements practiced and sure. She was slowly reclaiming herself, not because the past had been erased, but because this small, quiet place had given her sanctuary from it. That evening, as the children slept, she sat by the fire and asked the question that had been hovering between them for weeks. "How long were you alone?" He poked at the embers with an iron rod, his gaze fixed on the flames. 3 years since my wife passed. She was sick for 2 years before that. They were hard years. Quiet. "I'm sorry," she said softly. He gave a slight nod, accepting the words without ceremony. Eliza looked down at her own hands, calloused from work but softened now by soap and flour. She swallowed hard. "I used to hum when I cooked," she confessed, her voice barely above a whisper. "Back when things were normal. But my husband's brother, Silas, he hated it. Said music made a woman idle." James's jaw tightened, a muscle flexing along his cheek. "He sounds like a coward." She blinked. "He was my brother-in-law." "Still a coward," he repeated, his tone leaving no room for debate. She looked into the fire and found she had no argument to offer. The next morning, Clara found the letter. It was tucked into a crack in the doorframe, a crisp white envelope sealed with wax. James opened it, his expression hardening as he scanned the elegant, cruel handwriting. He read it once, then a second time, before folding it precisely and tucking it into his coat pocket. Eliza saw the change in him instantly. "What is it?" "Your past," he said, his voice like stones grinding together. "It's come to collect what it thinks it owns." Her legs felt weak. "What does he want?" "He's filed a claim with the county magistrate. He's claiming you're an unfit mother, that the children aren't yours to raise." She shook her head, a violent, disbelieving motion. "No, he can't. He never cared about them. He never touched them unless it was for a whipping. They were terrified of him. That's not how he's telling it. What do we do?" He didn't answer right away. Anger, hot and fierce, rose through her fear. "We'll leave," she declared. "I'll take them tonight. We'll just go." "And go where, Eliza?" "Where he won't find you. It doesn't matter. Anywhere but here. Anywhere he isn't." He crossed the room in 2 long strides, his presence solid and immovable. As an ancient oak, "You can't keep running." She opened her mouth to argue, but he cut her off, his voice quiet but absolute. "You don't run from a wildfire, Eliza. You stand your ground and fight it." Her eyes burned with unshed tears. "You don't understand what he's capable of." "I don't have to," he said gently. "I saw enough in the way you flinched the first time I handed you a cup." She turned away, covering her face with her hands. He didn't touch her, didn't offer empty comforts. That evening, Eliza began to pack, a frantic, quiet energy propelling her. She folded the children's meager clothes, the mended socks, the Bible with its fragile pressed flowers. Clara helped, her small hands trembling. "Are we going back to Uncle Silas?" she asked, her voice small. "No, sweetheart," Eliza whispered, her heart breaking. Never. Samuel stood by the door, refusing to put on his coat. Alice began to cry softly, and Leo hid himself under the table, a small, terrified ball. It felt like breaking a beautiful, fragile spell that had only just been cast. Eliza picked up their small bag, her resolve hardening, but when she turned to the door, James was blocking the way. "You're not leaving." "I have to. I can't risk him taking them. They need peace." "You found it here," he said, his voice firm. "Don't throw it away," because a snake hissed at the door. Her voice cracked. "If he takes my children, James, it will kill me." "He won't." She looked up, searching his face for the truth of his words. "Why are you doing this?" "Because," he said slowly, "some trees have to hold their ground, so the wind doesn't break everything else." The children watched, silent witnesses to the quiet battle of wills. Finally, with a shuddering sigh, Eliza sat back down, the bag falling from her hand to the floor. The next morning, James nailed a loose plank on the porch with 2 swift, decisive hammer blows. The wind was sharp, but he worked in his shirtsleeves, splitting firewood with a focused intensity, as if he were cleaving bone. Inside, Eliza found herself baking cinnamon bread, the scent filling the small cabin with a warmth that defied the cold outside. She didn't sing, but she hummed, a low, soft sound that only Alice seemed to hear. That night, James brought in an extra load of firewood and set his shotgun by the door. Eliza watched him, a brush in her hand as she smoothed Clara's long hair. "Will that be enough?" she asked. "No," he said, without looking at her. "But I will be." Later, when the fire had burned down to glowing embers and the children were asleep, tangled together under their quilts, Eliza whispered into the darkness, "Thank you, James." He didn't reply, just continued to sit in his chair, his silhouette, a study in unwavering resolve, guarding the fragile peace they had built. Outside, the world was silent and white, but a storm of a different kind was gathering, and this time, Eliza would not have to face it alone. The sun that morning was a pale, watery disk in a sky the color of bone. Eliza had been awake for hours, her hands submerged in the cold water of the wash basin, scrubbing a pot that was already clean. A strange calm had settled over her during the night, the unnerving stillness that precedes a storm. James was already outside. She could hear the rhythmic, steady thud of his axe splitting wood, a sound that was both comforting and ominous. She had learned to measure safety in small increments, the radiant heat from the hearth, the scent of fresh bread, the diminishing frequency of Leo's nightmares. But she knew that safety was a fragile shelter, especially when men like Silas Kane knew where to find you. Just before noon, a buggy appeared at the end of the long dirt track, its polished wheels and sleek horse a stark contrast to the rugged landscape. James stood on the porch, his arms crossed, a silent, unmovable sentinel. Eliza wiped her hands on her apron and stepped outside, her heart a frantic drum against her ribs. Silas Kane disembarked as if he owned the very ground he stood upon. Behind him was a lawman Eliza didn't know, a young sheriff whose badge was too shiny and whose eyes held a deep uncertainty. "Afternoon," Silas said, his voice slick with a false civility. "I hear you've been playing house." Eliza didn't answer. James remained silent, his gaze level and hard. The sheriff cleared his throat. "Ma'am, I have a writ here from the county magistrate. Mr. Kane is claiming kinship and custody of these children, on the grounds that, well, that you're not fit." "That arm of hers still looks tender," Silas added with a smirk. "Those children look like they haven't had a decent meal in a year. It's not a safe environment." Eliza found her voice, a thread of steel weaving through her fear. "You never once cared if they were safe. They're my blood, and family belongs together." James took a step forward. "Then the thing you call home is what they were running from." Silas's eyes narrowed into slits. "And who are you to say anything about it?" "I am the man who gave them a warm bed, put food in their bellies, and watched them sleep without fear, for the first time in God knows how long. The sheriff looked from one man to the other, clearly out of his depth. "Sir, the law is the law. I'm here to do what's right," James said, his voice low and unwavering. Eliza stood taller, her own resolve hardening. "They are my children. Blood doesn't make a father." The sheriff sighed. "Without legal standing, ma'am, my hands are tied." Eliza's gaze flew to James. He held her eyes for a long moment, a silent conversation passing between them. Then, he turned to the sheriff. "Let's fix that then." She stared at him, bewildered. "What?" He stepped forward, his voice carrying clearly in the cold air. "The preacher is on his way." Silas let out a derisive laugh. "You think some pathetic backwards wedding will change anything?" Ignoring him, James kept his eyes on Eliza. A wild, impossible hope surged through her. She searched his face for any sign of coercion or pity. There was none. Only a quiet, steady offer. "I never asked you for this," she whispered. "I'm not asking you now," he replied. "I'm just standing where I said I would." "This is insanity," Silas spat. "No," Eliza said, her voice clear and strong. "This is grace." The sheriff looked torn. "He's not wrong. Legally, a marriage would change the custody terms significantly." James met Eliza's eyes. "You don't have to love me." Her voice trembled, but not with fear. "I already trust you. That's a rarer thing." As if on cue, the children emerged from the barn, drawn by the tension. They walked slowly, Clara leading the way, her chin held high. Samuel clutched her hand, while Alice and Leo stayed close behind. They didn't need to ask what was happening. They understood. An hour later, the preacher arrived, a weathered man with kind eyes. Laura wore the simple grey dress, the one that had belonged to James's wife, which now felt like a mantle of strength. James wore a clean shirt, his hair slicked back with water. He stood beside her, solid as the mountains behind them. The children stood in a row beside them, a small, fiercely loyal vanguard. Clara held a small bouquet of winter weeds. There was no music, no celebration, just the soft, silent fall of snow as the preacher spoke words that felt less like a vow and more like a fortress being built around them. When it was over, James didn't kiss her. He simply took her hand in both of his, a slow, deliberate gesture, and held it as if it was something precious. Silas sneered from his buggy. "You think that little performance changes anything?" James stepped off the porch, the newly signed marriage license in his hand. "The law says you can't take the children of a man's wife without proving he's unfit to care for them, and you have no proof." Silas's face contorted with rage. "I'll be back, with a real judge." "You come back here with anything but peace in your heart," James said, his voice dangerously low, "and you'll find more than paperwork waiting for you." The young sheriff raised a hand. "That's enough. This is settled for today. Let the courts handle the rest." He climbed back into the buggy, his expression troubled. Silas hesitated, then followed, casting one last, venomous glare at Eliza. "I should have left you in the dirt with my brother," he hissed. Eliza met his gaze without flinching. "I'm not the one who needs burying, Silas." They rode away, their departure swallowed by the silence and the falling snow. Back inside, the cabin felt both the same and irrevocably changed. Eliza stood by the fire, her children clustered around her, their small hands clinging to her dress. James stood a few feet away, his shoulders finally relaxed. "You didn't have to do that," she said softly. "I did," he replied. "For them, for you." He paused. "Your name is on the land deed now, alongside mine. So are theirs." She blinked back tears, a faint, genuine smile touching her lips for the first time. Outside, the sun was setting, painting the horizon in fiery strokes of orange and red. That night, as Eliza brushed Alice's hair, she felt a sense of peace so profound it was almost painful. James watched them from the doorway, his expression unreadable. He didn't approach, just turned to tend the fire. As Eliza lay down, her body finally learning the shape of rest that wasn't tainted by fear, she whispered into the quiet dark, "Maybe it's not where you run that matters." And in the stillness of the cabin, with the wind sighing against the glass, the thought completed itself in her mind. Maybe it's who stands beside you when the running is over. The final confrontation came on a morning so still and cold, the world seemed to be holding its breath. Inside the cabin, a fragile domestic peace had taken hold. Eliza moved with a newfound grace, a dusting of flour on her apron, as she made pancakes. James sat at the table, carving a small wooden horse, while Clara read aloud from a book, her voice slow but steady. It was a perfect, ordinary moment, the kind Eliza had once believed she would never have again. Then came the sound of hooves. Too many of them. James was on his feet before the sound had fully registered, his face a grim mask. Stay inside. 2 wagons pulled up, carrying Silas and 5 other men. The young sheriff was not with them this time. James opened the door before they could knock. Silas dismounted, waving a piece of paper. Got it this time. Farmer, a writ from a judge, who owes me. Says the children are to be placed in my care. Eliza stepped out behind James, her voice ringing with a strength she didn't know she possessed. A favor from a corrupt judge doesn't make it right, it makes it law. Silas sneered. He turned to his men. Get the children. They hesitated, looking at the formidable figure of James Boone filling the doorway. I wouldn't, James said, his voice a low growl. There are 6 of us. Silas scoffed. You'll only have to get through one of me, James replied. But I promise you, it will cost you. It was then that Eliza stepped forward, moving past James to stand directly in front of Silas. You know, Silas, she said, her voice surprisingly calm, I never used to look you in the eye. You always thought it was because I was afraid of you. You were, he sneered. No, she said, her gaze unwavering. I was disgusted. A ripple of unease went through the men behind him. You used my husband's death to try and control me, she continued, her voice rising with every word. You called me and my children a burden, and now you want them back, not because you love them, but because you can't stand the thought of me being free of you. You don't want a family. You want property. One of the younger men, his face, chapped by the wind, shifted his feet. She's got a point, Silas. You never said nothing about raising kids. Silas whirled on him. You work for me. The man looked at Eliza, at James, then at the ground. He took a step back. Then another man followed his lead, and then a third. Soon only 2 remained by Silas's side, and they both looked deeply uncertain. You can leave now, James said, or you can stay and be shamed. Silas's face was a mask of fury. This isn't over. Oh yes, it is, Eliza said. He stared past her at the children, framed in the doorway, Clara, defiant. Samuel, clutching a piece of wood like a club, Alice, holding the family Bible like a shield. And Leo, his face pressed into his mother's skirt, silent but unafraid. Defeated, Silas mounted his horse and rode away, his hired men trailing behind him like a funeral procession. Inside, Eliza sank to her knees, not from weakness, but from the sudden, crushing weight of relief. James knelt beside her, placing a steadying hand on her shoulder. She didn't cry. She just leaned into his strength, the fire crackling behind them. Later that evening, as the children played quietly by the hearth, James stood at the window, watching the snow begin to fall again. You're a strong woman, Eliza Winters. She looked up from where she sat, Leo asleep in her lap. I was terrified. And yet you stood between your children and a monster. She considered this for a moment. Maybe being brave isn't about not being afraid. Maybe it's about being afraid and standing your ground anyway. He nodded. I used to wonder if God saw what happened to us out here, she said quietly. James's voice was gentle. He sees, but maybe he waits to see what we'll do for each other first. That night, after she had tucked the children into bed, she found James sitting by the door, the shotgun resting across his lap, not out of fear, but as a silent promise. You didn't have to marry me to protect us, she said. He looked at her, his eyes reflecting the soft glow of the firelight. I didn't marry you for them, Eliza. I married you for who you are, for what you've made this place again. What's that? She whispered. He reached out and took her hand, his calloused fingers wrapping around hers. A home outside. The snow fell, covering the old tracks and making the world new again. The war was over. The healing was just beginning.